drama instructor. Dora Maver had enrolled as a student in 1909 and had begun teaching in 1921. It seems a fitting conclusion to the Margaret Eaton School that literature and expression returned at the end to take a final bow. Thank you.
So Ben Faber's going to join us now. He's from Redeemer. He's in the English department here. I had for a long time read that Emma had written a play called The Message. And I would go to old bookstores and everywhere, especially when I was up in Owen Sound, where I was trying to find it, couldn't find it anywhere. And then with a Faber donation, it was in there. And I thought, oh, it'd be fascinating if somebody could sort of dissect this play that she wrote. And so I leaned on Ben a little, and then I said, Ben, can you do this? And he said, well, I'll read it. He sent me like about a 5-page email back saying, this is what's all going on, but I don't have enough time to do this. I said, well, you already did it. Like, it was all written. And so he finally agreed, it twisted his arm enough. And he says, but I might also take a bit of a critical approach. I said, that's fine. Like, it's not all happy celebrations, too. So a bit of a critical look at the message, and thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, John, for inviting me to read the play to begin with. I lived in the 17th century. So this is really outside my comfort zone. I know very little about Margaret Eaton School. I know very little about the situation of the play that I'm describing, but I'll try my best. I just want to note one other thing. I'm going to refer to Emma Scott Nasmith to acknowledge that she married Colonel George Nasmith in 1916. He's a World War I veteran, and she referred to herself as a war bride. It should be said from the outset that the play that I'll be talking about, Emma Scott Nasmith's The Message, is relatively obscure in Canadian theatre history. As far as I can tell, the only performance of the play in the public record took place at the Royal Alexandra Theatre on Tuesday, June the 8th, 1920. The play was the final item on the program of the closing ceremonies that included selections from Robin Goodfellow and Other Fairy Plays for Children, as well as selections from The Taming of the Shrew. The second half of the program began with dance, written and performed by students, a solo piece entitled Vive la France, and an ensemble piece entitled Diana and Her Hunting Party. The final performance before the closing address was Nasmith's The Message. The program had begun with numbers acted by the primary school and the junior school, the senior school, and performed the dance numbers, and now the associate players were to perform an original composition by the principal. A social reporter from the Globe, no, a social reporter, not the theater critic, a social reporter from the Globe commented, brightly composed and sympathetically acted, this number brought forth much well-deserved praise both for the author and the actors. My question today is simply this. What is there about The Message that deserves such praise that afternoon in June 1920? What is it about this play, one that frankly sank into total obscurity in the theatrical and literary world? What is it about this play that embodies something significant for the Margaret Eaton School at that moment? In her career as principal, in her involvement in the art scene in Toronto, and in the history of the school itself, The Message would not be something for which Nasmith is celebrated, let alone remembered. And yet, The Message, I will argue, may have played a minor but important role in responding to the trauma of the First World War. Public expressions of mourning at cenotaphs and memorial services, such as the one here in June 1922, when Mrs. Eaton unveiled a new tablet of the fallen soldiers of Timothy Eaton Memorial Church. These events function symbolically as rituals of remembrance. How then might the performance of The Message that June afternoon in 1920, how might it function in the collective consciousness of the Margaret Eaton School? The setting of the play is the living room of Mrs. Elizabeth Hawthorne, a dainty, fragile old lady over 70. Between the two entrances, and this is a sketch from the, it's in the archives, a sketch of the stage, of the sort of blocking of the opening scenes. Between the two entrances are latticed windows with flowering bulbs filling the entire length of the window. Mrs. Hawthorne is dressed in a quaint flowered silk with rare old lace at her throat and wrists. We get the impression that, like Nasmith herself, Mrs. Hawthorne has American roots. She refers to having spent time in Colorado, for instance. Her black manservant, William Ringo, has been in the family, man and boy, for 50 years. That would mean since 1870, after the end of the American Civil War. The play is set in winter, at the present time, in a rural town in Ontario. I don't know if you can all see this, but as I read passages from the play, I'm going to project it from the archive. So the play begins with Mrs. Hawthorne seeming to listen to someone invisible. "Yes, dear, I hear you calling. Tell your mother what is wrong." She goes over to the window, the stage correction says. She draws the curtain aside, and she looks out, arranges the flowers, waters some. Her manservant, William, puts his head in the door, and with an understanding nod, withdraws. William knows that Mrs. Hawthorne is more attuned than most to spiritual things. He knows that she gets messages from the living. Mrs. Hawthorne says, "Yes, I feel today I should get a message. All day someone has been calling to me." Again, William's head appears at the scullery door, and then he hums. He hums an old plantation song. "I'm gonna join the great association, then my little soul's gonna shine." This is the first of several ways in which Mrs. Hawthorne's spiritualism and William's Negro spirituals seem to align. A few minutes later, we see Mrs. Hawthorne again, listening to invisible voices. She says, "Yes, darling, I hear you calling me all day long. What is wrong, dear? Tell your mother. She is still listening, apparently listening to voices we cannot hear." And then she says to her manservant, "William, I've been looking for news all day. I seem to hear someone calling me." William replies, "Well now, that's strange, Miss Hawthorne, but I seems to feel like that myself. I does too, but I specs it's 'cause we is excited over Miss Constance coming home. You know, I have been powerful lonely for that little lady since she went away to school." Excuse my accent, I'm not an accent. "I suppose it's 'cause I helped raise her, the poor little thing. She was such a little pickaninny when her ma, Miss Henrietta, died." I was practicing this the other day. My wife said, "Don't try it, just don't do it." Mrs. Hawthorne's granddaughter, Constance, arrives from Toronto with her friend Noreen. Connie and Noreen are modern city girls. Noreen wears her hair in a bob, and Connie's speech patterns are distinctly urban and contemporary, unlike those of Mrs. Hawthorne and William. For a lark, Connie asks Susie, the maid, to tell Noreen's fortune. Susie, studying Noreen's teacup. "I see here a very fair person with a golden head, and something very heavy hanging over it." Constance says, "Susie, you are a witch. That's the prince with the golden head, the Prince of Wales, and that's the crown of England he's threatened with. I believe it is hanging heavy over his golden head. We all fell in love with him in Toronto. He danced and he danced with Noreen, and ever since, her temperature has either been subnormal or over 100. I tell you, it is pretty hard on all her friends. I have brought her here to be cured of the prince." And Noreen says, in a dreamy, faraway tone, "I don't want to be cured. He is just a dear boy. He told me he wished he was a cowboy. He wants to have fun like other boys, and he's got to be a king." Earlier in the play, William had told Constance about a local black man, Dick Green, who had returned from France and who was decorated with a Victoria Cross. Connie's mention now of the visit to Toronto by the Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VIII, is another specific post-World War I reference, this time not a fictional one. The Prince of Wales had indeed come to Toronto in the fall of 1919, so the previous fall, and he was very popular with the soldiers, having served in France himself, and he was extremely popular with the girls. It sort of reminds me of Prince Harry coming to the Invictus Games in Toronto. It's a similar sort of buzz that's happening with him. He's a bachelor. He's quite the dandy, is the Prince of Wales. The Toronto Daily Star reported on November the 4th, 1920, Lady Henry was the hostess of a delightful dinner dance last night at Government House, given in honor of His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales, when 4 of Toronto's prettiest girls were invited. Prince Edward was probably still recovering from, quote, a most strenuous day. I had to include some Hamilton references here. So, a most strenuous day in Hamilton on October the 19th, 1919. The Royal Ball, so I'm quoting now the report. The Royal Ball on Friday was the most brilliant social function held in this city in many years. During the evening, he, that is Prince of Wales, followed his custom of choosing his partners. To Miss Wilkinson easily goes the honor of having been called the Belle of the Ball, for she danced with His Royal Highness no less than 6 times during the night. The Prince danced every dance and the encores until 3 a.m. Saturday. The Margaret Eaton School audience, watching the message that June afternoon in 1920, is in fact invited to relive a particular aspect of the post-war recovery, namely the romantic idealism represented by the gallant Prince of Wales a few months earlier. Shortly after Susie reads Noreen's fortune, Miss Hawthorne's niece Priscilla comes into the room with an armful of practical-looking woolens, and a Ouija board slips out and rolls with a clatter on the floor. So yes, we have a leading character who communicates with spirits. We have a housemaid who reads fortunes, and now we have a Ouija board. William says, "For the Lord's sake, what that, Miss Constance?" Noreen answers, "Oh, William, that's a Ouija board. And William, it tells you all about the living and brings you messages from the dead." William, stage direction said, scared to death. "I've seen the picture of one in Eaton's catalogue. Brings back messages from the dead. I tell you, there's a heap of messages I'd like to get just now, but I'd rather hear from the living than the dead today. I've been reading about Sir Oliver Lodge, and the 20th Plane, and the Angel at Mons, and the 3 Horsemen, and the Choir Invisible." I couldn't trace the reference to the 3 Horsemen, but the other items in William's surprising reading list are actually well-known examples of spiritualism. The Choir Invisible is a poem. It's invisible there. The Choir Invisible is a poem by George Eliot. "Oh, may I join the choir invisible of those immortal dead who live again in minds made better by their presence." The other reference, the Angel of Mons, is a celebrated account of an unexpected victory by the outnumbered British at the Battle of Mons in August 1914. In a short story published shortly after this battle, Arthur Machen imagines phantom bowmen protecting the British soldiers. Many readers believe the story to be true rather than fictional. The other reference, the 20th Plane, is by Albert Durrett Watson. It's a book of psychic revelations from historical figures such as Walt Whitman, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Abraham Lincoln. The other reference to Sir Oliver Lodge is probably the most interesting of these spiritualist references for our purposes. Sir Oliver was a British physicist respected for his work on magnetism, radio frequency, atomic energy, and electricity. And Sir Oliver was a spiritualist. He believed that one could communicate with the dead. This belief became poignantly personal for Lodge when his own son, Raymond, was killed in the First World War in a battle in France in 1915. Lodge described his communication with his dead son in a book that was published the following year, Raymond or Life and Death. The Margaret Eaton School audience that afternoon in the Royal Alexandra Theatre knew all about the sensational Sir Oliver Lodge. In fact, earlier that year, in March of that year, Lodge spoke to a packed Massey Hall audience in Toronto. Lodge says that his motivation for speaking is to correct an unhealthy fixation on the body in death. I'm quoting here, and so this is Lodge quoted in the Globe in March, and this play was performed in June. So the audience would have remembered Sir Oliver Lodge's visit to Toronto. And this is what he said: "Let me beg of the bereaved people here to believe that their sons and brothers and husbands are in no sort of way, extinct or hurt. Bullets and shells are not among the awful things that assault and hurt the soul. They themselves, Their memories, characters, affections persist. They are more aware of us than we are of them. They long for us to think affectionately of them, although not to mourn them unduly. To cultivate the science of communication, if so it may be, whether through mediums or otherwise, and look forward to reunion. The reference to Eaton's catalog in William's little speech is a little cheeky on Nasmith's part. But I did a little hunting, and sure enough, in the 1918-1919 fall and winter catalog, you will find the Ouija board. For $1. For $1. Whether the Nasmiths had attended that lecture by Sir Oliver Lodge at Massey Hall that evening, we don't know. But we do know that there's another character in the play, the neighbor boy, his name is Jamie Buchanan. He read a newspaper article reporting on a visit by Sir Oliver Lodge. And Jamie quotes, this is hard to read, Jamie quotes Sir Oliver Lodge, "That Ouija board is pure imposition. When I read Sir Oliver Lodge's speech, I felt like throwing my cap and shouting. I rather discourage Ouija boards," said he. "Ouija boards with automatic writing may be all right, but most of the results are from the subconscious mind. People are too prone to believe what they get from that source. Why would anyone bother with any speeches the so-called spirits have given to the world? Nothing they say has been worth a row of pins to humanity. So, bosh, say I." That's the character Jamie speaking. There was an article in the Boston Daily Globe, dated January 16, 1920, in which indeed there was a speech by Sir Oliver reported in the Boston Globe, where Sir Oliver advised persons of weak minds to keep away from the Ouija board. He said he did not believe in it as an instrument, and said that if a person did not possess a strong force of mind, there was danger that if strong application was made on the board, it might affect his mentality. So this could explain why one of the characters in the play, Constance, said, "I'm sure grandmother would not like William or Susie to try it." And Mrs. Hawthorne herself later says, "Constance, if only they have fun with it, but look at William's face now," as William sees the board, and William stands over the Ouija board in a terrified contemplation. Mrs. Hawthorne says, "He is such a child, with the imagination of a child, and the superstition of his race as well." There is certainly some ambivalence when it comes to race in this play. On the one hand, William is clearly a trusting and trusted, loving and loved member of the family. On the other hand, he represents the naive spiritualism which Nasmith wants to correct. The play actually shows that the Ouija board is misleading, that it is merely a parlor game, that it has no real spiritual power. Communication with the living is what matters. And the message of the play seems to be, cultivate telepathic connections with the living, thereby transcending distance, and make those who are physically absent spiritually present. And this is something that the black man, Sir William, appreciates more than anyone in the play. Sir Oliver Lodge actually described telepathy as follows. He said, "The human body is really a sort of telegraph station, which receives communication through the senses, conveys them to the mind, and then, by means of speech or writing, to convey this knowledge from one mind to another. A very crude and complicated system is telepathy. Telepathy is the direct action of mind upon mind, the transference of mental impressions by means unknown." And this is what Mrs. Hawthorne in the play is seen to be doing, or attempting to do, especially at the beginning of the play. The audience knows that something has happened to her son, Samuel, because another character, Priscilla, she went to town, she came back with a telegram, but she doesn't want to show Miss Hawthorne that she has this telegram. She doesn't share the news that her son, Samuel, has died. The communication that Mrs. Hawthorne is listening for has stopped because her son has died. At this point in the play, Mrs. Hawthorne tells her visitors a story from her experience in Colorado of communicating with her brother across distance at a time when he was in acute danger. But what about the dead? What about communicating with the countless dead whose broken bodies lie in unmarked graves across Europe? Mrs. Hawthorne replies, "I don't know. it doesn't seem as if it would be possible if our ears were keen enough to hear it. I don't often think about it, but I cannot recall ever having received a definite message from the dead. Yet there are indefinite impressions, strange feelings that come over me sometimes, that I have been in touch with those who have gone before. Beyond that, I cannot say. Constance, Noreen, and Jamie, they go tobogganing. Good physical activity in a small rural town in the winter. They go tobogganing, and Mrs. Hawthorne goes out, and she returns with the baby clothes of her son, who is serving in France. She and her servant William, they reminisce briefly about his birth, and this is the final scene of the play. William says Mars Samuel was that baby's name. Mrs. Hawthorne, yes, William, your poor little master has been in my arms all day. You remember, you used to sing him to sleep. I will just hold my baby in my arms till you sing him to sleep. William, stage director says, goes quietly, setting the table and humming softly. He's humming Deep River, I'm going to pass over Jordan, Deep River. Mrs. Hawthorne, bring the book, William. Stage direction says, William brings it and reverently places it on the table in front of his mistress. Then he and Susie sit in chairs on either side of the window. Priscilla sits on the footstool in front of her mistress, while Mrs. Hawthorne reads in a lovely, quiet voice, quote, in my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you, I go to prepare a place for you. In the final stage direction of the play, the room has grown darker until only Mrs. Hawthorne's face is seen. Then all is flooded in golden light. Mrs. Hawthorne stretches out her arms and her face shines as if transfigured. She gets the message that her child has passed over the river. Slow curtain, the end. In a feature article on Nasmith in Saturday Night, later that summer, this is September the 11th, 1920, the reporter writes, quote, amid all her other labors, she has taken time to write a play, The Message, which was produced at the closing exercises of the Margaret Eaton School last June at the Royal Alexandra Theatre. In this little play, which is exquisite in theme and handling, the author puts to shame the popular Ouija board and shows how man may rely upon his own innate spiritual faculties for real spiritual revelation. She believes that spirit with spirit may meet, and that there is no need for such expedients as the planchette, that's part of the Ouija board. Now, this might be an accurate summary of the message of the play, but it does not capture the collective cathartic experience that Nasmith's audience may have undergone that afternoon. So I'm going to end with 2 concluding remarks and 3 quick questions. First of all, central to the Canadian experience of war for parents, siblings, and friends of soldiers in France was the anticipation of a message, of news, of a serious injury or of death of a loved one. The message, the play that is, offered its audience, and its female members in particular, a way of transcending distance, absence, and reality that was brought about by the war. In her qualified endorsement of the telepathic theory of Sir Oliver Lodge, and in her dismissal of the popular occultism of the Ouija board, Nasmith integrated Negro and Christian spirituality as a means of healing the wound of distance and assuaging the pain of absence in death. The play is, as it were, a public performance of closure at the end of the 1919 school year, but also it was a way of allowing the events of the First World War to be laid to rest, that those events could also cross over into memory. At the same time, however, I cannot shake the feeling the message is a curious play. And there are 2 aspects in particular, the question of race and this odd mixture of Christianity and spiritualism. I'm not quite sure what to make of that. The second comment I want to make in conclusion is that is more of a historical or historiographical one. I'm a non-specialist, but even from a cursory review of the literature, my impression is that research on the effect of the First World War on Canadians as individuals and on Canada as a nation is focused primarily on the male experience of the war and its aftermath. Perhaps social historians should be looking more to women's writing to understand fully the Canadian response to war. Paul Fussell, his landmark study, The Great War and Modern Memory in 1975, he effectively locked down the criteria for World War I literature. And it's essentially ironic, modernist, and male. Literary canons are helpful, but they always exclude as well. I'm not suggesting that Emma Scott Nasmith should be included with the great poets of the First World War, but I am suggesting that we could look more to the role played by cultural artifacts such as the message in Canada's collective response to the trauma of World War I. So 3 questions that I have. First of all, does this thorny issue of race crop up elsewhere in the life of the Margaret Eaton School? I'm thinking about curriculum, or thinking about recitals and recitations. Were there any students of color, or any people of color at the school? Secondly, does the spiritualism of the message align with other aspects of the school? We know that Emma Scott Nasmith was interested in the spiritualism of W.B. Yeats, that's already been mentioned, but that was in her role in public readings and in local theatrical activities rather than the curriculum of the school, as far as I understand. So my question is, what role does spirituality or spiritualism play in the life of the school? And the third question is, were there students at the school from 1914 to 1920 who lost fathers or brothers in the Great War? Has anyone cross-referenced the school rolls, the staff, the students, the alumni, with the lists of soldiers who died or were injured in the war? Because such information would make the effect of this strange, bewildering, but intriguing play that much more interesting. Thank you.
Hey, John, thank you. That was brilliant. And you know this theme of human spirituality and that we connect with other living people. Who asked me the question about a story from my great-grandmother?
Oh yeah, you just left on the phone call.
Okay. So here's the what do you call it? The ESP moment of that question. Is I didn't have a story for her, but you've given me the story. And it directly relates to characters in the play. So when, the protagonist, Mrs. Hawthorne. When Mrs. Hawthorne's son is off and is in danger and she receives messages from him, is a story that I did get from my mother about a story that her grandmother told her about her mother. So Emma Scott Raff has a daughter, Dorothy Scott Raff, I guess, Dorothy Raff, who marries Bob Fennell, my grandfather. When they were dating, when Bob Fennell went off to the First World War to avenge his older brother, who had been killed in the First World War before he went off to the First World War. Bob was one of these first soldiers who was affected by mustard gas. Dorothy woke up one night in a dead sweat, went into her mother's room and said, something terrible has happened to Bob. And they got the news the next day that he had been invalided out of the war as a result of mustard gas. And that's Mrs. Hawthorne's son, who in the play dies, in real life makes it back to Canada with emphysema for the rest of his life from mustard gas.
And Colonel George Nasmith is the one who invented the mask, right?
That's right. Yeah. That's fascinating. Thank you for that. That was brilliant.
I'm just thinking that the issue of race may be connected to Owen Sound because it was a terminus point for the Underground Railroad, and there was quite a large black community there, and there were also a lot of black servants that was common at the time as well. So that's my guess.
So in terms of students that were there too, I don't know many black students. There was one student in Japan. I think of the 420 students, I think there was only one student that I'm aware of that was of a different color.
But the issue of race is played out throughout physical cultural activities with clog dances and various kinds, which coming from psychology, the study of psychology and issues around race.